All right. Yeah, thank you, Charles, and thank you to the CPI staff for having me back after all the damage I did many years ago here. But these Pathways articles, I should say, are like 1,200 to 1,500 words, but it still took 4 people to pull it off. And so I want to begin by acknowledging my co-authors, Beth Mattingly, who's also affiliated with CPI, and then Sophie Collier, and Luke Aylward at Columbia. And basically what we're going to do is look at generational changes in poverty and receipt of benefits from what we call the safety net here. I tend not to love the term safety net. I'm really talking about income support policies from government, taxes and transfers. And so our broad questions are, do we see any evidence of generational change in the prevalence of poverty, deep poverty, associated metrics? Is there evidence of generational change in the effectiveness and size and scope of what we'll call the safety net and its core components? And do we see demographic differences in these potential generational changes? I was sort of nervously watching Christine's presentation earlier and Harry's presentation because employment, earnings, income all aggregate into measures of poverty and inequality because individuals live together, pool resources, or so we think, and either have enough resources to pool to escape poverty or not. Luckily, I think my findings are broadly in line with what they showed. So what we do, the approach we take is we use the Current Population Survey, which is the large national household survey that's used to produce annual poverty statistics. And we, like Christine did, pool across 50 years and pull people in different generations, wherever they fall in whatever given year of data at the time that they're 30 years of age. So we're comparing millennials at 30 to Gen X at 30 to baby boomers at 30 and silent generation at 30. We use what's called the supplemental poverty measure, which the census has been releasing since 2011, which is thought to be an improved measure of income poverty, and improved in that it counts a broader array of resources, including resources that come from tax policy, so earned income tax credit, child tax credit, but also in-kind supports, things like food stamps, housing subsidies, school lunch, et cetera. It makes some other changes, but I won't dwell on that. We at Columbia have used the supplemental poverty and estimated it back in time to the 1960s. So 1967 is the first year that we've been able to estimate it. The data is all public. It's on our website if you want to go use it yourself. And then we use a slight variant, which we call an anchored supplemental poverty measure, which means we take the 2012 poverty line or poverty threshold and just adjust that back in time for inflation. And the reason that that's important is because any changes that we see will be derived from changes in income and resources and not changes in the poverty line, whereas the supplemental measure would use a relative approach that changes with living standards. So there's pros and cons to both, and we can talk about that if we want in the Q&A. We use the same years pretty much that everyone else uses. Note that the millennials at 30 are a smaller group at this point. More and more millennials will age to 30 as more and more data becomes available. Race ethnicity, just a quick note, isn't collected consistently in the Current Population Survey. So when we show some of that, it begins in 72. And note that the unemployment rate faced by 30-year-olds at each generation are broadly similar, although the baby boomers do show higher rates of unemployment at their 30-year mark, right? So for all other groups, it's around 5.5% to 6%. For the boomers, a little bit higher. I'm going to take the Derek approach because I can't see very well. So this just shows the income to needs distribution, which is total resources divided by the poverty line. And it's broken up into deep poverty, which is under half the poverty line. David Grusky likes to call it shallow poverty. I don't love that term, but non-deep poverty, if you will, near poverty, 100, 200, et cetera. So a couple things to note about this graph is the poverty rates across generations are broadly similar. For baby boomers, they were a bit higher, but again, their unemployment rates were higher, as I showed in the earlier graph. But overall, at age 30, the millennials don't look much different than prior generations. One caveat to that is deep poverty rates among millennials are somewhat higher, at 5.3% as compared to 4.2, 4.6 in prior generations. On the flip side, if you look at the darker blue bars, that's far above poverty, or over 300% of the poverty line. that group has increased in size since prior generations, which points to that sort of bifurcation and growing inequality that others on the panels have noted. Now, the other way that the supplemental poverty measure is useful is you can measure the relative impact of government policies and programs on the poverty rate. So here we do that using a measure of total taxes and transfers. So that includes SNAP, welfare, unemployment insurance, Social Security, any government policy or program that is designed to support Americans' incomes. And here you can see what to look at is in the red and green on the right, which is the relative reduction in poverty rates across generations at age 30. For the silent generation, the earliest generation, the total effect is actually negative, and that's because taxes paid outweigh any resources that would reduce poverty from social support programs. But you can see that it's also been growing over time. So for millennials, the poverty rate is 26.9% lower because of the resources counted from government taxes and transfers, right? And so you can see that, whereas before I had noted that the poverty rates are broadly similar, the only reason that that is the case is because of the resources coming from taxes and transfers. So without taxes and transfers, the millennial poverty rate at age 30 would be 21%, as opposed to 15% among the silent generation at the same age. This just shows things broken down by race and ethnicity. So we only have the sample size to do this for white non-Hispanics, black non-Hispanics, and Hispanics. And what you see is that the percent reduction from taxes and transfers is not doing much to reduce racial and ethnic inequalities, right? So around 30% for all groups, a bit less for Hispanics. That's in relative terms. In absolute terms, the safety net is reducing things markedly more for Black and Hispanic Americans and reducing those disparities. Now, we're also able to look at the resources that are coming from government taxes and transfers, and we put these all in 2016 dollars, and you can see that the millennials are receiving substantially more at age 30 in income support than prior generations. And we break that down by type. So you can see the growing importance of nutrition programs like SNAP and WIC. You can see the decline in the gray of cash welfare as AFDC was transformed into TANF. But then you also see this interesting growth in other cash transfer programs. So this kind of surprised us a little bit. So this is non-cash welfare, but it's things like unemployment insurance, Social Security, and SSI. So at first we were like, why are these folks getting Social Security, right? And when we took a peek into the data, you know, there's been another increase for millennials has been the rise in multi-generational living. So it's not that they're personally getting Social Security, but they're increasingly living with people who are collecting Social Security. We can also look at the relative impact of different safety net programs or government policies or programs for each generation. And here you kind of see a similar story to what I just showed. You can see the growing importance of tax credits among millennials. That's that second bar in yellow. You can see a growing impact of the SNAP program. So none of this is major news. You see a big decline in the importance of the cash welfare program across generations. And you do see like a modest but significant increase in, not statistically significant, but actually significant increase in the role of housing and reducing poverty rates. All right. So what's the bigger picture? That we don't see much evidence that poverty has increased. We do see some small evidence that deep poverty has increased across generations. However, this is largely because of the growing role of the safety net and income support policies and programs in the budgets of low-income millennials. The composition of the safety net and its effects are also changing over time. So another thing we're seeing is a disappearance of cash welfare and increasing reliance on benefits that are delivered through the tax system and in near cash or in-kind form. Although this interesting exception that people are living in units and that share resources with other cash benefits like unemployment, SSI, and Social Security. I should say we did try to unpack this a little bit, and there's more work to be done on that. When we look at the three major components of other cash assistance, UI, SSI, and Social Security, they're actually all increasing a little bit. So it's not just one program that's driving this. And then we've also tried to look at what we call nuclear families versus multi-generational or extended relationship families. And you see it much more in the extended family generations for sure, but it also does rise and increase for these nuclear families. So unpacking this is going to be sort of an important next step. So in terms of the broader next steps, we want to take a broader look at the different components of pre-tax, pre-transfer income, which Christine and others have done some work on already. And then we really want to sort of unpack the sort of who's living with whom and who's sharing resources with whom question. And all of this is at what's called the SPM unit level, which is basically a family unit, right? It's different than a family unit in that cohabitors are treated like family members. But what that doesn't treat as family members are roommates, non-relatives, et cetera. And so we want to also look at the household level and see about the living relationships and the pooling of income within broader units. So, thank you.